So let's talk about one of the most famous faces in history. But what did Jesus actually look like? For centuries, art has given us a pretty consistent answer. But now science is stepping in with a completely different take. We're going to dig into the true face of this iconic figure, moving past tradition and straight into the world of forensics. Okay, check this out. On one side, you've got the image we all know, right? Long brown hair, beard, fair skin. It's the image that's been the standard for about 1,500 years. But on the other side, you've got this question posed by modern science. And this contrast, this is really the heart of what we're talking about today. Where did that familiar image of Jesus come from? And how does it hold up against a scientific reconstruction? All right. So first, let's tackle that image we all have in our heads and figure out how this artistic tradition even got started. So you'd think the first place to look would be the Bible, right? I mean, it's the primary source. But here's the wild part. The New Testament, the part written closest to his actual life, is totally silent about what he looked like. Seriously. Not a single word about his height, his hair, his eyes, nothing. Now, this is really fascinating. Think about the story of his arrest. The fact that Judas had to literally point Jesus out to the soldiers, that's a massive clue. It pretty much tells us that he looked completely and utterly unremarkable. He just blended right in with the other Galilean guys standing around him. So, since the Bible gives a zip, early followers had no idea what he looked like either. And that led to a pretty fierce debate. For centuries, opinions were all over the map. I mean, on one side, you had people like the philosopher Celsus, who looked at Old Testament prophecies and argued Jesus must have been plain, even ugly and small. But on the other side, you had theologians like St. Augustine, who insisted that as a son of God, he must have been the absolute peak of human beauty. Well, eventually, the beautiful Jesus side won out. Around the 6th century, this image, the one you see right here from a church in Italy, it became the standard. It's got the long, parted brown hair, the beard. But get this. This look was inspired more by paintings of Greek gods and Roman emperors than by any historical reality. And to help really cement this new standard look, a bunch of documents started to appear. Documents that, well, we now know were almost certainly fakes, created just to fill in the blanks. One of the most famous forgeries was this letter of Lentulus. It supposedly came from a Roman governor and, surprise, surprise, it described Jesus exactly as artists were starting to paint him. And of course artists all over the world just naturally painted a Jesus that looked like them, that resonated with their own cultures. And that's why we see a white European Jesus, a black African Jesus, an Arab Jesus, and so on. Okay, but what if we could just bypass all of that? All the art, the myths, the forgeries. Well, that's exactly where modern science steps in, using bones and data instead of paint and wishful thinking. Let's talk about the field of forensic anthropology. Yeah, this is the same science that police use to identify victims and solve crimes. A medical artist named Richard Neve had this brilliant idea. What if he could use these exact same techniques to solve one of history's greatest mysteries? So Neve's team got to work with this really methodical, data-driven process. First, they got their hands on 3 well-preserved skulls of Simamite men from the exact same time and place as Jesus. Then, using CT scans, they made a super detailed digital map of those skulls. From there, they used established data about how thick facial tissues are to digitally rebuild the muscles and skin layer by layer before making a final physical model. And the result, well, it's pretty incredible. The face that came out of that lab was radically different from the one in all those Renaissance paintings. This was the face of a 1st century Jewish man from Galilee. So the skull gives us the basic structure of the face. But what about the rest? You know, the hair, his build. Well, other historical and archaeological evidence helps us fill in the missing pieces to get a more complete picture. Let's start with that iconic long hair. Turns out that's probably wrong too. The Apostle Paul, a guy who actually knew Jesus' family and disciples, wrote in a letter that it's a disgrace for a man to have long hair. It's really unlikely he would have written that if Jesus himself had long hair. Plus, drugs we found from that time showed Jewish men with short hair. Skeletal remains from the period also give us clues about his build. And get this, the average Semite male back then was about 5'1" and weighed around 110 pounds. That is a world away from the tall, slender figure we usually see in Western art. So when you put all the pieces together, here's the profile you get. A man who was a product of his time and place, somewhere between 5 feet 1 inch and 5 feet 5, muscular from working as a carpenter, with weather-beaten, olive brown skin from being outdoors. His hair would have been short and dark, his eyes brown, and yep, he would have had a beard, which was just part of Jewish tradition, and his clothing would have been simple and practical, too. I mean, he wasn't walking around in those long, flowing robes you see in paintings. That was for the rich. As a craftsman, a carpenter, he would have worn a simple, knee-length wool tunic, just like the guys you see in this fresco from the same time period. Now look, this scientific reconstruction isn't a perfect photograph. It's the face of an average man from that time and place. But as the theologian Charles Hackett points out, that's kind of the whole point. Seeing Jesus as he likely was, a Middle Eastern Semite, is this powerful reminder of his real historical context and of our own habit of picturing him to look just like us. So when we move from this idealized, almost mythical image to one that's grounded in actual history and science, it gives us a totally fresh perspective. It doesn't change the message, of course, but it does change the messenger. It reminds us he was a real person who lived and worked in a specific corner of the world, and it invites us to maybe reconsider his story through that more authentic lens. So the real question is, what changes for you when the Jesus you picture looks less like a European painting and more like a man from Galilee?